The courtroom doors were not supposed to open again that morning. The judge had already called for a 10-minute recess. The insurance company's lawyers were already packing their folders with the smug efficiency of men who believed the hearing was over, and Walter Kane, 79 years old, in a suit that had not been worn since his wife's funeral, was already reaching for his cane to stand up and accept defeat. Then the doors opened. Not quietly, not one or two latecomers slipping in to watch. They opened wide, and they kept opening because there were 67 people trying to walk through them at once. Farmers, ranchers, a retired schoolteacher, a gas station owner. Men and women whose faces the town judge had known his entire life, filing in with the particular grim quiet of people who had not come to watch. They had come to testify. Each one of them was carrying a single sheet of paper, signed and notarized, and each one of them sat down without being told where. The insurance company's lead attorney, a man named Griffin Ashford who had spent 11 years making rural claims disappear on technicalities, turned around in his chair and felt, for the first time in this case, something other than confidence. "Your Honor," Walter Kane said, still standing, his voice steadier than his hands, "you said I had no proof of drought. I'd like to introduce 58 years of it, and I brought 67 people who watched every single year of it happen." That was the moment the case actually began. 3 months earlier, the letter had arrived on a Tuesday, and Walter Kane had read it standing at his own kitchen counter with the same rainwater-stained hands that had turned soil on that land for over half a century. Claim denied. Insufficient documentation of qualifying drought conditions. No verifiable proof of loss. He read it twice, then a third time, slower, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Cedar Hollow Farm had lost 80% of its wheat crop that year, not from neglect, not from bad seed or poor management. From a drought so severe that 3 counties over, the state had already declared it a disaster zone for 2 of his neighbors' land. But Kane's policy was with a smaller regional insurer, Ashcroft Mutual, and Ashcroft Mutual's position was simple. Without an official meteorological station report specific to his exact parcel of land, there was no drought. There was only a farmer having a bad year. His wife Alina had died 4 years earlier. His son had moved to the city after college and had no interest in the farm. There was no one else at that kitchen counter to read the letter with him. No one to share the particular cold feeling of watching 60 years of your family's work, reduced to a line item that a company had decided to erase with a single form letter. He called the number listed. He was transferred 4 times. Each representative used the same phrase, like it had been handed to them on a card. "We understand this is frustrating, but the documentation does not meet our threshold for a qualifying event." What Walter Kane did not tell them, not yet, was that he had documentation. He had documentation going back further than most of the people denying his claim had been alive. The barn at Cedar Hollow Farm was not just for animals and machinery. In the back corner, behind a wall of tool shelves that hadn't been touched in years, there was a cabinet that Walter's father had built in 1952. Inside that cabinet were 58 spiral notebooks, one for almost every year since Walter was a young man working his father's fields. Each one filled with the same entry written every single morning without exception. The date, the temperature, and the rainfall measured by hand in a rusted gauge that had been replaced exactly twice in nearly 6 decades. It had started as his father's habit, a farmer's obsession with knowing exactly what the sky was doing, because in that part of the country, the sky decided everything. When his father passed the farm to him, Walter simply kept doing it. Every morning of his life, before coffee, before chores, he walked to the gauge, wrote the number down, and moved on with his day. He had never thought of it as extraordinary. It was just what you did if you took farming seriously. He pulled the notebook for the drought year out first. Then, almost as an afterthought, he pulled the notebook from 30 years earlier, when there had been a drought nearly as bad. Then another, from 12 years before that. He sat at his kitchen table that night with 58 notebooks stacked in front of him, and for the first time since the letter arrived, felt something other than despair. He did not have insufficient documentation. He had more documentation than any insurance company had ever seen from a single policyholder in that region. The problem wasn't proof. The problem was that Ashcroft Mutual had never expected him to have it, and had built their denial on the assumption that he wouldn't. If the insurance denial had been the first blow, the second came 2 weeks later, and it came from a place Walter had trusted for 31 years. First National Prairie Bank held the mortgage on Cedar Hollow Farm, a loan Walter had taken out a decade earlier to modernize his irrigation system back when the bank's regional manager was a different man. One who understood what it meant to lend money to a farmer whose collateral was the land his grandfather had cleared by hand. That manager had retired. His replacement, a younger executive named Preston Doyle, worked from a downtown office and viewed Cedar Hollow Farm as a line on a spreadsheet with a missed insurance payout attached to it. Without the claim payout Walter had been counting on, he fell behind on his loan payment for the first time in 3 decades. One missed payment. 31 years of a perfect record, and one missed payment because an insurance company had decided his 58 years of rainfall data didn't count. Doyle's letter arrived less than 10 days after the missed payment, far faster than any prior correspondence Walter had ever received from the bank. It cited a clause buried in the refinanced loan agreement that allowed the bank to initiate foreclosure proceedings after a single default if the loan was flagged as high risk, a designation that Walter would later learn had been applied to his account the same month the insurance company denied his claim. It did not take a genius to see the shape of it. Ashcroft Mutual denied the claim. First National flagged the loan. And somewhere in a conversation, Walter would spend the next several weeks trying to prove existed. Someone had decided that Cedar Hollow Farm, 340 acres of prime river bottom land, was worth more to certain people sold off in pieces than kept in the hands of an aging farmer with no heir interested in running it. Doyle's letter used softer language than Ashcroft's, wrapped in phrases like restructuring options and voluntary sale considerations. But underneath the language was the same message: give it up now, or we will take it from you later. Walter Kane had buried his wife on this land. He had no intention of losing it to a spreadsheet. Every lawyer in the county who handled insurance disputes turned Walter down within the first phone call. Ashcroft Mutual was a well-funded regional insurer with a legal department that had crushed smaller claims before, and Griffin Ashford's reputation for grinding rural plaintiffs into settlements or exhaustion was well known. Most attorneys did the math and decided an old farmer with a denied claim wasn't worth the fight against a firm like that. The fifth call was different. Marisol Vega had opened a one-woman practice 18 months earlier in a strip mall office above a hardware store, after leaving a mid-sized firm where she'd spent 6 years watching insurance companies bury claimants under paperwork rather than argue the merits. She had grown up on a cattle ranch 2 counties over. She knew what drought did to a family, and she knew what it felt like to watch people in suits decide that knowledge on the ground didn't count as evidence. She drove out to Cedar Hollow Farm the same week Walter called her, and when he brought out the first 10 notebooks and laid them on the kitchen table, she went quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Kane," she finally said, "do you understand what you're sitting on?" "Rain," Walter said, "58 years of it. You're sitting on the single most detailed independent climate record for this specific parcel of land that I have ever seen outside of an official weather station. This isn't just proof of one bad year. This is a baseline. You can show exactly how far outside of normal that year was, using your own records, going back further than any state database they could point to." It was the first time in 3 months Walter Kane had felt something close to hope. Vega's strategy was built on a principle she explained to Walter over their second meeting. Ashcroft Mutual hadn't just denied a claim. They had denied it using a technical definition of qualifying drought conditions that required data from an official meteorological station, a requirement that, as it turned out, most small family farms in the region could never meet because the nearest official station was often 40 miles away and measured conditions that didn't necessarily reflect what was happening on a specific piece of land. Walter's notebooks did something the state station couldn't. They proved conditions exactly where his crops were dying, not 40 miles away. But Vega knew that a defense attorney like Ashford would attack the notebooks as unverifiable, an old man's personal record, potentially inconsistent, potentially exaggerated to fit a claim. That was when Vega asked the question that changed the shape of the entire case. Mr. Kane, in 58 years of measuring rainfall on this farm, is there anyone else who ever saw you do it? Anyone who measured alongside you, or compared notes, or farmed nearby and remembers the same droughts? Walter thought about it for a long moment, and then he laughed, the first real laugh Vega had heard from him. Miss Vega, there isn't a farmer within 15 miles of here who didn't complain to me about the same droughts I wrote down. We used to compare notes at the feed store every single dry season for 40 years. Half of them kept their own records too, even if they weren't as particular as mine. Vega's plan formed almost immediately. If Ashcroft Mutual wanted to argue that one farmer's notebooks were unverifiable, she would bring them a small army of neighbors who had lived through the exact same droughts, on the exact same land, during the exact same years, and get every one of them on record. Over the following 6 weeks, Vega and Walter drove to nearly 90 farms and ranches across the county. Some of the people they spoke to had known Walter Kane their entire lives. Others were younger farmers who had only heard stories about the droughts of decades passed from their fathers and grandfathers. Almost every single one of them had the same reaction when Walter explained what Ashcroft Mutual had told him, that there was no proof his land had experienced drought. No proof. One rancher, a woman named Doris Whitfield who had farmed adjacent to Kane's land for over 40 years, said when they visited her, "I lost half my herd in the same drought he's talking about. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign." Not everyone had records as detailed as Walter's, but many had something. Old tax filings showing crop loss deductions, faded photographs of cracked fields, insurance claims of their own from decades past, and most powerfully, clear memory. Vega had each willing witness sign a notarized statement describing what they had personally observed during the drought years in question, cross-referencing dates directly against Walter's notebook entries wherever possible. By the end of the 6th week, they had 67 signed statements. 67 people willing to stand behind one farmer's word, not out of sentiment, but because every one of them had lived through the same dry seasons on the same stretch of land, and knew exactly what he was talking about. Griffin Ashford, when he received the witness list during discovery, reportedly asked his paralegal to double-check that the number was correct. The first hearing did not go the way Ashcroft Mutual expected. Ashford opened with the argument that had worked in dozens of similar cases. Personal records, however extensive, could not substitute for certified meteorological data, and the claim had been correctly denied under the explicit terms of the policy. He was smooth, confident, and clearly unbothered by an old farmer's notebooks, which he characterized to the judge as a well-intentioned but ultimately unverifiable personal diary. Vega's response was simple. She did not ask the judge to accept the notebooks as scientific data. She asked the judge to consider them as sworn testimony from a man measuring conditions daily on the exact land in question, corroborated not by one witness, but by 67 others who had lived through those same conditions on neighboring land, many with their own supporting records. Mr. Ashford wants this court to believe that the only valid proof of drought is a number from a station 40 miles away, Vega told the judge. I'd like this court to consider what actually happened on this land described by the man who worked it every day for 58 years, and confirmed independently by 67 of his neighbors, who had no reason to lie and everything to lose by telling the truth about how bad those years really were. The judge, visibly startled by the sheer volume of supporting statements, granted a continuance rather than ruling immediately, giving Ashcroft Mutual 30 days to respond to the full witness list before the next hearing. It was in that 30-day window that First National Prairie Bank made its move. Preston Doyle's letter arrived on a Friday afternoon, a formal notice of intent to foreclose, citing the missed payment and the high-risk designation on Walter's loan. It gave him 60 days to either pay the outstanding balance in full or accept the bank's offer to purchase the property directly at a valuation that Vega, after one look at recent land sales in the county, called insulting. It was not a coincidence, and Vega knew it. She began quietly investigating the relationship between First National Prairie Bank and Ashcroft Mutual, and what she found was not a smoking gun conspiracy, but something almost worse, an unspoken alignment of interest. Doyle sat on the board of a regional land development group that had, over the previous 3 years, quietly acquired several foreclosed farm properties in the county at below-market rates, several of which bordered land recently rezoned for expanded commercial development. Cedar Hollow Farm's river-bottom acreage, Vega discovered, sat directly along a proposed access route for that development. She couldn't yet prove Ashcroft Mutual, and the bank had coordinated directly. But she didn't need to prove collusion to make the pattern impossible for a judge to ignore. She simply needed to show that Walter Kane's claim was valid, because if the claim was valid, the missed payment that triggered the foreclosure clause would never have happened in the first place. The insurance case and the foreclosure case were now the same fight. Word travels fast in a county where everyone's grandparents worked the same land. By the time the second hearing was 2 weeks away, most of the town knew the shape of what was happening. An insurance company denying an old farmer's legitimate claim. A bank moving to seize his land almost immediately afterward, and 67 of his neighbors standing behind him with sworn statements. The local paper ran a short piece on it. Then a regional outlet picked it up. Doris Whitfield, never one to stay quiet, gave an interview describing exactly what she'd told Vega months earlier, that she had lost half her herd in the same drought Ashcroft Mutual claimed never happened. The pressure did something unexpected. 2 more Ashcroft Mutual policyholders in neighboring counties came forward, describing eerily similar denials for drought claims using the same insufficient documentation language. Vega added both cases to her file, not as part of Walter's lawsuit, but as evidence of a pattern. A company that appeared to systematically deny claims it expected policyholders couldn't prove, regardless of whether the drought had actually occurred. One of those policyholders, a young couple who had taken over a small dairy operation from the husband's parents only 4 years earlier, told Vega they had nearly lost everything after their own claim was denied on almost identical grounds. They had no 58 years of notebooks. They had no network of neighbors old enough to remember decades of dry seasons. They had simply accepted the denial, assumed there was nothing to be done, and taken out a second loan to survive the year. Hearing that story was, for Walter, harder to sit through than anything Ashford had said in either hearing. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect, that his case was not unusual because the denial was unusual. It was unusual because he happened to be the one policyholder in the region who could actually fight back. That realization changed how he spoke about the case, in interviews and in the feed store and at his own kitchen table. He stopped calling it his lawsuit. He started calling it the drought case, as if it belonged to everyone who had ever been told their loss wasn't real enough to count. Ashford's confident posture from the first hearing had visibly shifted by the time the second hearing approached. His firm requested a private settlement meeting with Vega, offering Walter a partial payout in exchange for dropping the case and signing a non-disclosure agreement. Walter's answer took him 4 seconds. "Tell them no," he said. 58 years of rain doesn't come with a price they get to set. Which brings the story back to where it began, the courtroom doors opening, and 67 people walking through them. The judge, after regaining his composure, allowed the recess to continue slightly longer than scheduled while the courtroom settled. When proceedings resumed, Vega called witness after witness. Farmers who described dust clouds rolling over fields that should have been green. A retired schoolteacher who remembered the well at her family's property, running dry 2 summers in a row. Doris Whitfield, steady and unflinching, describing cattle she'd had to sell off at a loss because there was nothing left in the pasture to feed them. Each witness statement lined up, almost eerily, with an entry in one of Walter's 58 notebooks. Ashford's cross-examinations, usually his sharpest tool, found almost nothing to work with. These weren't people testifying from vague memory. They were describing specific years, specific losses, specific conditions that matched a written record kept in real time, decades before any lawsuit existed to motivate someone to lie about it. By the time Walter Kane himself took the stand, walking slowly to the witness chair with the same cane he'd nearly used to accept defeat months earlier, the courtroom had the unmistakable weight of a case that had already turned. "Mr. Kane," Vega asked him, "why did you keep these notebooks for 58 years? Walter considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because the land doesn't lie, even when people do. My father taught me that if you want to know the truth about a season, you don't wait for someone 40 miles away to tell you. You walk outside and you look. I did that every single morning of my life. I never thought I'd needed to prove anything to anybody. I just thought it was what a farmer does if he respects the ground he's standing on." There was no cross-examination question that landed after that. The judge did not take long to deliberate. In his ruling, he stated plainly that Ashcroft Mutual's denial had relied on an unreasonably narrow definition of qualifying documentation that failed to account for detailed contemporaneous corroborated evidence directly from the affected property, evidence that, in his words, exceeds in specificity and reliability what many official meteorological reports could offer for a single parcel of land. He ordered Ashcroft Mutual to pay the original claim in full, along with statutory interest for the delay, and additional damages for what he characterized as bad faith claims handling, citing the pattern evidence from the two other policyholders Vega had brought forward. The foreclosure case, tied directly to the missed payment that never should have happened, was dismissed the same month, with the judge in that proceeding noting the timing between the loan's high risk designation and the insurance denial as at minimum worthy of further regulatory scrutiny, a note that would later prompt an informal inquiry into First National Prairie Bank's lending practices. Preston Doyle was quietly reassigned to a different branch within the year. Griffin Ashford's firm settled the two additional policyholder cases before they ever reached trial, including the young dairy couple, who used part of their settlement to pay off the second loan they had taken out simply to survive a denial they never should have received. Vega, for her part, found her one-woman office above the hardware store suddenly busier than she'd ever expected it to be. In the months following the ruling, half a dozen farmers from 3 different counties came to her with insurance disputes of their own, several of them holding onto old ledgers, tax records, or handwritten logs they had never thought to consider evidence until they heard what an old man's notebooks had done in a courtroom. She kept every one of those cases, and she kept Walter's original 58 notebooks photocopied in a binder on her office shelf. Not as a trophy, she told him once, but as a reminder of what patience looks like when it finally gets its day in court. Walter Kane still keeps a notebook. The rainfall gauge behind the barn was replaced the following spring, the 3rd time in his life, and the 59th notebook sits in the same cabinet his father built, right where it belongs. He didn't sell the farm. He didn't need to. Some mornings, before coffee, before chores, Doris Whitfield's grandson, a teenager who'd started helping out on weekends, walks out with him to check the gauge, mostly out of curiosity, sometimes just to keep an old man company. Walter doesn't explain why he still does it. He doesn't need to. The land doesn't lie. It never has. It just waits for someone patient enough to write down the truth, year after year, long enough for the world to eventually be forced to listen.